Breaking the gray.
If it weren't season 3, season 3 is just every episode we say, why can't we figure out the technical issues? We've been doing this for so long. This is like the second year. Should be easy, Sarah. Why is it so hard?
Yeah. Technology. It's out to get you.
Yeah.
I think it's a mood thing going on. So in Canada, we have essentially 3 telecom providers. And one of them, you may or may not have heard, last week had a massive outage nationally. People could not call 911, and it went on for days for certain people. So maybe it's like one of those, people keep saying that Mercury retrograde thing. Maybe it's like a really long phase of Mercury retrograde.
I hope it's that, not something more sinister, because that all sounds a little bit worrying. But yes, let's go with Mercury retrograde. It's the least of our worries, hopefully.
Yeah. And before we go any further, everyone's probably wondering, who is that wonderful voice that we have here? And it's a second time having you on. Natalie, great to see you again.
It's Nathalie Niddam. Actually, back by popular demand, Nat, because we did a quick stack episode with you. And then we had people write to us to say, we didn't actually get what we needed from Natalie. So it's so glad that you've agreed to come back on.
Yeah, it was our all-time leading downloaded episode of all time for us.
Wow.
Yeah, so you're famous in the Rebel Scientist world. You're very famous. So thank you for gracing us.
In the Hall of Rebels, you're up there.
Nice. That's a good hall to be in. I like a Rebel hall. I'm in.
Yeah.
But it's great that you've come back. I mean, actually, I think probably the reason why you're so popular is because you had such an interesting topic. Because in the world of biohacking, well, of course, and your gracious self, but it's such an interesting topic because we need new stuff all the time. We're constantly looking for new stuff. And in the world of biohacking, this world of peptides that have got such expertise in now, it's relatively new and it's fascinating. But I also think it's quite mysterious and people don't really know what it is. So it would be great if you could just kind of give us the basic guide to peptides to start with. And then, of course, because I'm constantly obsessed with updating my brain, it would be cool if you could maybe talk about peptides from the point of view of optimizing brain health. But I think, first of all, we need to go back to basics and really tell people exactly what it is we're talking about today.
For sure. Thank you so much. And yeah, I agree. It's the topic more than anything. The topic of peptides was very much an undercurrent thing and it's been around for quite a long time in some way, shape, or form. I mean, if you talk to bodybuilders, to me, very, very often I would call them the original biohackers, right? These are people that have been doing everything that they can to manipulate their physiology for a really long time. And they definitely are some of the earliest users of peptides that we know about. So to answer your question, what is a peptide? A peptide is really nothing more than a small protein. And when we talk about proteins, they can be really, really big. Proteins are composed of amino acids, which are the building blocks. And proteins, we know, can be hundreds, thousands of amino acids long. A peptide, by definition, is 50 amino acids or fewer in length. And then, I'll kind of do a double stream here and say we have peptides and we have peptide bioregulators, which is the other category, which is now a subcategory of peptides, if you will, that's also gaining a lot of ground and a lot of awareness to people. And peptide bioregulators are the tiniest of the peptides. They are 2 to 4 amino acids long. So they are minuscule little molecules. The difference between the two, I would say primarily, is when we're using a peptide, very often we're using it. I mean, they're both signaling molecules, but a peptide is more likely to attach to a receptor on the outside of a cell and initiate a cascade of events in the cell or at a tissue level. So some of the most common ones that people may have heard of might be things like BPC 157, BPC standing for body protective compound, or TB4, which is thymosin beta 4, which is a thymus protein. So they're small proteins and they activate these cascades. So in the case of BPC 157, for example, it is very well known as a peptide that can be very helpful for healing the gut, healing anything in the GI tract from the mouth right down to the bum. Like there's some really interesting rat studies where they inflicted horrifying kind of anal fistulas on these rats and found that BPC 157 was actually very helpful in healing those. And if anybody has ever suffered from something like that, these are very difficult wounds to heal, if you will. But BPC 157 is also really good for the brain. It's really good for healing musculoskeletal injuries. Like it's kind of like, I like to call it the, what's the name? It's the Swiss Army knife of peptides because it does so many different things. The bioregulators, on the other hand, are so tiny, that 2 to 4 amino acid chain, that they can penetrate the cellular membrane, they can penetrate the nuclear membrane, and they actually act at a gene level. So they are epigenetic switches. So they actually will bind to DNA and allow that helix to unwind, if you will, in certain areas, which will allow for the upregulation of the production of certain proteins. And so the way that bioregulator peptides are most often used is really with an intention to regenerate and restore function to different tissues, glands, and organs in the body.
So when Nathalie, you said some people may have heard of, and then kind of you listed off a number that I'd never heard of, where do you think people would have heard of this? Because it sounds to me like, it hasn't even got a commercial name yet. I mean, that name presumably is a name that's given because of its scientific structure. So why would people have heard of it, and how, and where has it actually come from? I mean, I know you said it's used in bodybuilding, but how did they discover it?
So these are lab compounds. So BPC 157 is naturally occurring in our gastric juice. So it is a peptide. It was a protein that was isolated by a scientist at some point. I wish I knew the history, but off the top of my head. But essentially, the peptides almost always are, actually, I think always are synthesized in a lab. But they are always mimicking pre-existing sequence of amino acids that naturally occur in the body somewhere. I'm saying always, there's a possibility there's not exceptions to that, because even if it's part of a bigger protein, that sequence is naturally occurring. And so it has a receptor, it has a home, and it's funny. I think when you're in a domain like this, we assume that so many more people know things than really do, right? So people who listen to my podcast will be familiar with some of these things. People who are members of my Facebook community, and then other people like me who are out there talking about it. But I think we forget that it's still a very small group of people that have this on their radar. There's an increasing number of peptide summits that people may be watching. So I think that the learning curve is very steep, but I'm starting to just see it and bubble up more into the early adopter mainstream, if that makes any sense.
It does. So this is really direct from physiology research. Physiologists have started to find these very small peptide chains. They've documented the place for them in physiology, presumably through doing animal studies, and also maybe from a need to develop medicines, perhaps.
Yeah.
And now it's filtering into biohacking because people are starting to see an application for optimization, which is really like the start of mainstream, is that the biohackers start to adopt it for some kind of optimization. So we're kind of at this very early stage where we haven't even really got catchy names that people can actually understand. Because I mean, you said that name probably 5 times and I've still forgotten it now. I know it starts with BP something.
Well, you got that. Well, you're ahead of most people, because most people will get the B and the C and the B. It's like an alphabet soup, right? Thymosin alpha 1 is TA1, thymosin beta 4 is TB4, then BPC 157. And it's just like, oh my Lord, could you possibly be making this any more confusing? So to your point, I mean, if you go to PubMed and type in BPC 157, and you will be blown away by the number of papers and clinical trials that have been going on for a really long time. And now it's starting to gain amplitude. And I think this has been going on for a while, is that pharma is really starting to turn their attention here. which is a good news, bad news story, right? Because on the upside, we're going to have a lot more research being done in this area. On the downside, you're going to start to see some of these compounds that people have really started to rely on for their health and well-being. And it's not always optimization. Sometimes it's actually people who are not in homeostasis, who have got certain health issues that are finding that these compounds are incredibly helpful for them. And now they're being studied by the pharma company. They will make some kind of a modification to it. And now they patent it. And so now we're starting to see some of these things like thymosin alpha-1, for example, which is a really powerful immune peptide in the immune space, disappearing. Like even compounding pharmacies are getting cease and desist letters because it is actually a drug. It has a name called Zadaxin. It's approved in over 30 countries in the world. It got given orphan drug status, I believe, in the US. But the bad news is when a pharma company gets a hold of it, they start to determine how it can be used. And that is usually a very narrow application because they've been able to, in their trials, they're like, oh, we know it can do this. And all the other things it can do, which is inherently one of the reasons why peptides are so amazing, is that they are pleiotropic. And pleiotropic's a really fancy name for super versatile. A peptide will do not just one thing, it can do many, many different things in the body. And so what happens is you've got, thymosin alpha-1, for example, is really, really good for people with autoimmune conditions. It has been shown, and there are clinical trials you can look up on PubMed, where thymosin alpha-1 has been incredibly helpful for treating people who are very, very sick with COVID-19. And yet, nobody's really talking about it. And all these people on the autoimmune side who've been using it all of a sudden are saying that they can't get their hands on it anymore because that's not what it's being studied for.
I see. So at the moment, who is manufacturing and distributing the peptides?
Good question. So if you're working with a physician, your best bet to get peptides is through a compounding pharmacy. And so, but again, thymosin beta-4, which is now being defined as a biologic, is starting to get pulled out. And so they're no longer able to, I'm sorry, I'm going to sneeze. Maybe not. No. Okay, good. I'm going to save you people from the big sneeze.
Good save.
So thymosin beta-4 is starting to be pulled off. So that's the main channel. When we get into the world of biohackers and people who, and in the biohackers, I feel we have two groups of people. We have people who are ready and willing to use their body as a lab just to see what's going to happen, or can they get an edge? And then you have people who've hit a wall, people who've been trying to go at a health issue every way that they can think of, and they're just not getting anywhere. And so both of these groups of people, for varying reasons, are willing to take matters into their own hands. And they may work with a practitioner, they may work with any number of types of people, but they will actually source these peptides from research labs. And there's a couple of good big names out there that are doing a really good job. But, we're all kind of on the wobble board here because for now, for whatever reason, this has been allowed to go on. There may come a time when, governments kind of maybe or either governments or big pharma is going to, turn the laser over to there and maybe slow things.
So is it fair to say for people that we need to kind of put out a little bit of disclaimer? There's a little bit of try this at your own risk kind of thing. But these are things that have not been assessed, presumably by the FDA, but these are things that are proven to have efficacy in some of the things you've talked about and are now being distributed either by the pharmacy or by these small biohacking companies that are starting out.
Yeah.
And at the moment, we're looking at anecdotal evidence as opposed to big clinical trials.
So we're definitely a lot of anecdotal evidence, definitely a lot of clinical evidence from some of the physicians who've been using them. But again, not the massive, big, long-term double-blind clinical trials, because who's funding those, right? The people who are funding those are typically the drug companies. And if they're going to do that, and I'll give you an example of a peptide where that exact thing happened, where they're going to fund it, but if they're funding it, we're going to pay. But I do think that there's a lot of information on PubMed about many of these compounds, not all of them. But the disclaimer is valid that we don't know all the side effects. They do affect different people differently. Like BPC 157, which I'll come back to, I keep coming back to because it's kind of like the center of things right now. BPC 157 has been, when I first started kind of digging into peptides and using them, I was told, oh my God, BPC 157, the safest peptide, nothing ever goes wrong. It's perfect. It's amazing. It's blah, blah, blah. At the time, I'd been doing what I was doing long enough to go, really? Because I've never heard of anything that affects everybody well. There's always someone. And it took about a year of running my Facebook community and a few thousand people. And the next thing you know, you start to hear from people that say, everybody else, BPC 157 is amazing. It healed this, that, and the other thing. And then you start to hear from people going, yeah, I use BPC 157. My anxiety goes through the roof, or I can't sleep anymore, or I get really angry. And I'm sitting there scratching my head going, well, on paper, BPC 157 balances the dopaminergic, serotonergic, and GABAergic systems of the brain. These are all neurotransmitters that are, you've got happy, you've got reward, and you've got calm. You've got those three dwarfs, if you will. And yet these people, it affects them completely differently. So you have to be aware that whether it's because you have some other underlying condition or your particular balance neurochemistry is different than other people's, it may be imbalanced. It may be the equivalent of, when you were on a teeter-totter as a kid, if the big kid came along and slammed down on the teeter-totter on the opposite end, you'd go flying off the other side. It may be that it'll come back to the middle eventually, but that shock is not a positive. So I do think that it's smart to do a lot of homework, do your due diligence, and connect with whether it's a physician or a health coach or even someone like me. I mean, I'm a health coach, and I'm putting together what I'm hoping is going to be a course or a guide that kind of helps people to get a grounding in this space. It's not going to be do this to get that, because in peptides, we don't really have that yet. It's not like take one aspirin and call me in the morning. The dosage, there's a lot of art to the science of dosing peptides. And you have to be, I often describe it to my clients as feeling your way through in a dark room, right? You're taking a careful step, you're feeling your way. You have to be very aware of how your body is responding to things. And again, either you or whoever you're working with has to have some kind of understanding of what are the drivers of what's driving the issue that you're trying to address. Because, if I had to pick the one question that I get the most often that drives me the nuttiest is there a peptide for fill in the blank? And the answer is almost always, it depends. Why is this happening? What is the driver? You need to understand what is it that's getting you to this problem so that we can start to see what is it, whether it's a peptide or a supplement or a lifestyle change or a nutrition change or whatever it is, what is it that's contributing to this so that we can start to understand how are we going to try to bring something to the body that allows it to get a handle on it. Which brings us, I think, to the concept that I think that's the most exciting about peptides and bioregulators is that what we're trying to do is these are compounds that are going to enable the body to kind of do what it does best. So they're initiators of cascades. They are not the doers, if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. Maybe you can give us an example so we can get our heads around it of, somebody that you have successfully recommended certain peptides to and what it's done for them.
Yeah. So, one of the most, I think, impressive examples of this, and this happened fairly early on, is I had a woman come to me who had a non-union joint fracture in her wrist. So a non-union joint fracture is basically, this was a bone that had broken and they couldn't get the bone to come back and knit together. And so she was at the point where her doctor was sending her to a surgeon for her to have surgery. So what they would have done is they would have put in a screw or a plate I don't know enough about the details of her condition, and nor am I a doctor, to be clear, but whatever it wasn't, the bones were not knitting themselves back together again. So I would say today, I would have added one other thing to the protocol I proposed to her. But what we did is we used BPC 157, body protective compound 157, which is a very powerful healing peptide. We use thymosin beta-4, which is also a very powerful healing peptide. And we use a combination of two compounds, which are called growth hormone secretagogues. So these are peptides that that basically signal to your brain through two different pathways to increase your production of growth hormone. And we know that one of the benefits of growth hormone is it helps with healing of damage. The other really interesting thing is that BPC 157, one of the things that it does, in addition to triggering these healing cascades, is it upregulates the expression of growth hormone receptors. So now we've got more growth hormone floating around, if we can imagine it as baseballs floating around. And we've got our growth hormone receptors, the catcher's mitt, that have now opened up and are waiting to catch the growth hormone. So two different triggers, and we're talking about activity at the actin and the myosin level. A lot of very technical terms. One of the things that BPC 157 does is it also will increase blood flow to an area. It'll actually generate angiogenesis, which is the development of more microcirculation, if you will, around an injury. Now, I will tell you that this is one of the things that gives a lot of people pause for caution, right? Because when we think angiogenesis and an increase of blood vessel microcirculation, we think of tumors. Tumors are very good at creating these micro environments for themselves. So I would say that one of the caveats, even though nobody has ever said or shown that using BPC 157 will feed cancer, out of an abundance of caution, if somebody has active cancer, you're not going to run around just adding these things. You're not going to add fertilizer to the soup. So that was just kind of a caveat. In the case of this person, going back to our example, we use BPC 157, thymosin beta-4, and CJC and ipamorelin. So those are the growth hormone secretagogues. That's BPC 157 and TB4 are the repair peptides, if you will. And between that triad, in about 8 weeks, she went back to the surgeon. And I can't remember if it was 8 or 12 weeks. I think it was 8 weeks later. She goes back to the surgeon, and the guy just about fell off his chair. He was like, "What have you been doing?" Because those bones came back together again. So I said that I would have added one more thing to that if I was giving that instruction to someone today. Actually, I probably told her to use essential amino acids and bone broth and all the other things that we would talk about for helping bone healing. But pulsed electromagnetic frequency, which is a modality, has been shown to be very powerful for healing bones. And I would add that to the mix. But having said that, PMF on its own can do it. So in a way, it's kind of good that I didn't, because it showed that just the peptides on their own were able to do it.
Huh. And why do you think the body isn't doing it itself?
That's a really good question. And I think that it's also, as we age, we know that we don't heal as well, right? So it may be that as we age, because maybe there's more inflammation around, maybe proteins aren't expressing as well. We don't make as much growth hormone as we used to when we're younger. We may not be sleeping as well or as long as we need to, which also compromises our ability to make growth hormone. There's so many different things that could be contributing to the fact that in the case of an injury, maybe sometimes people just need that little extra push so that the body will kind of be able to bring its attention. Because if you think about it, as we age, our bodies are always repairing. Right? We're always doing repair work. Every single night you go to bed, your body is repairing something or other. And maybe it's just we don't have the resources necessarily to address the injury when we need it. Hard to say. But I do think that's a great question.
Yeah. Well, it's just, to me, it's like an external push of these processes. And I suppose the goal is to get yourself into that healthy state so that you don't need the external these substances. But it's testament to the fact that they must really be working for a lot of people, because the amount of people who have used them. We were both at PaleoFX when you were on the panel there, and the testimonies coming from there were quite astounding. These were very healthy people who were giving the testimonies.
Yeah, and it's something when you can get a healthy person noticing things, right? The other thing with BPC 157 that we see a lot of is when it comes to gut healing. So we damage our gut linings constantly. The litany of assaults on our gut integrity is long. I think there's nobody walking around right now that wouldn't benefit from some degree of stimulus to help the gut to heal itself periodically. And I think that I've seen BPC 157 be so helpful to people. And it shows up in the funniest ways, right? Because sometimes someone's very allergic and they'll do a run of BPC 157 and they'll be like, oh, that's so strange. My allergies seem to be better. Well, is it an antihistamine? No. But could sealing the gut and protecting the inside of the body from things that are outside the body, which is technically in the lumen of the stomach, right? Or the GI tract. When the tight junctions have been damaged, there's proteins that are going to make their way into the bloodstream that don't belong. And the immune system is then going to mount an attack. And that can give rise to inflammation or allergic responses or whatever the case may be. Just by sealing those tight junctions, all of a sudden you have a situation where you've kind of allowed the whole system to calm down.
Right. So when you say do a run of that particular stuff, what would that entail? So you would have to get this dose. How would you know the dose and when would you take it and how long?
Yeah. So for dosing, I mean, it's really all over the map. I would say, and I don't like to give people dosing ever out of context. And people in my group know this now. I mean, you know what? You look at people who are way smarter than me, doctors, and they never give dosing ever, unless they're sitting with someone in the context of a consult, right? So I don't either, but I would say with BPC 157, it generally starts around 250 micrograms a day. And BPC is one of those peptides that actually has a very short half-life, a very short window of activity. So typically it's used twice a day. Sometimes if we're working with someone who's got a really very aggressive issue, like with Crohn's and colitis, like BPC 157 has been shown to be very helpful in those situations. And I want to say not by itself, okay? It's part of an overall protocol. Sometimes we'll see people using it 4 times a day. Typically, a cycle of BPC 157, with or without TB4, CJ Simplemone, whatever the case may be, would be around 8 to 12 weeks, typically. Sometimes people will use it longer. I'm a big fan of cycling things and not just always, even with the growth hormone secretagogues, we have to protect the receptors. We have to be mindful that more is not always better with growth hormone.
And it's funny because we talk to so many biohackers and everyone says, oh, well, more is better constantly, right? But in this case, cycling is probably the right thing because you're probably also turning off the thing that your body is doing. You're teaching your body to not produce as much of what it was producing before. I imagine if you're just doing it every single day, is your body adapting and saying, I don't need it anymore. It's already there.
Yeah. I mean, the interesting thing about the growth hormone secretagogues, this is part of their magic. So they're not nearly as strong as using exogenous growth hormone. So that would be to inject growth hormone, like actual growth hormone from another source into your body. That will absolutely shut down your own body's production of growth hormone, which is why it's quite problematic. The growth hormone secretagogues, interestingly enough, do not cause that shutdown. They still allow for the natural feedback loops. Having said that, you still want to watch your levels. Now, growth hormone, as you may or may not know, is notoriously difficult to measure because our growth hormone levels don't stay constant. Growth hormone happens in waves, right? And again, everything in the body happens in waves, which to me is our biggest clue that anything that we do should be in waves. Now, how big those waves should be and how frequent is open for discussion. But when it comes to growth hormone and the growth hormone secretagogues, they still allow for the pulsatile nature of growth hormone release. So it's a very elegant way to kind of give the body an incentive, like a stimulus to make more when we need it, and especially later in life when we're making less of it for any number of reasons. But you want to measure, one of the ways to measure whether or not you're using too much of it is you might measure something like an IGF-1 level, which is produced by the liver in response to the presence of growth hormone. And so it's imperfect, but it's probably it's kind of like the only real analog we have right now. And we want to make sure those IGF-1 levels don't get too high, because that would again indicate that we just have too much growth hormone at work.
Are you saying secretagogues?
Yeah.
I was in my house thinking, God, it sounds like secretagogue. I mean, I've just watched Stranger Things, and it's like some creature, secretagogue.
I know, wasn't the last season the best?
It was.
Oh, it was a little bit creepy, wasn't it?
Yeah.
But what does gogs like? What does that mean?
Secretagogues? I think it just means that they promote the secretion of. So they're promoting.
Okay. So rather than the actual thing, it's the pre.
Yeah. So one half is promoting the production, and they're both promoting the release. Right.
Okay.
So we're giving that little nudge, and they're going at it through two different pathways. And there's some very strong ones out there. You've got GHRP2, GHRP6. You've got hexarelin. The problem with the stronger ones is, number one, typically you can really see that the receptors become numb. They involute over time, and in the brain for growth hormone, which would be a really bad idea. Number two, they also upregulate the production of cortisol and prolactin, which is another really bad idea. And number three, they can also drive hunger a lot, which is great if you have someone who suffers from cachexia and who needs to put on weight, which you can see where our bodybuilders would be very excited about some of these things. But the problem is that a lot of people are using these growth hormone secretagogues because they can help to promote lean mass and the loss of fat. They're not the perfect weight loss peptide. I'm going to put it out there right now. Some people are responders and will find that they get leaner when they use them. But for the most part, not necessarily. But you can imagine that if you're trying to lose a few pounds and all of a sudden you're ravenously hungry, this is a problem.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, the body is so complex. And to me, it's very interesting. We're kind of tweaking these very finely tuned cascades that are going in the body. Of course, there is going to be downstream effects of anything like this that happens. So I think probably it does sound like the wise thing to do is take some good advice before trying these things, especially if you can interfere with your brain chemistry.
Oh, for sure. I mean, the BPC 157, I would say that there's definitely people, and I would guess, that didn't listen to the science and just kept using it and using it and using it because they bought into the story that it's safe and nothing can possibly go wrong, that suffered from, their brain chemistry didn't come right back. Like they stayed anxious. Like it's scary, right? So I stay indefinitely, but it lasts. And when you're in a situation like that and you're not feeling yourself and you don't know, is it going to be a day? Is it going to be a week? Is it going to be a month? It's frightening. And that day, week, month, or 2 months can feel like it's like people with long COVID right now. They don't know what the finish line looks like. So it feels like an eternity. And this is why I really encourage people, like, if you're going to do this stuff, if you're going to play biohacker with your body. And I want to remind people, we only get one. I think sometimes people are surprised that I don't use more peptides than I do. I use the bioregulators like crazy, but the peptides, I use them when I need them in the amounts that I need. And I'm not the first person to run out and try a new peptide to see what happens. I'm like, this is the one body. I don't get another one, So I just think we have to be aware, respectful, and mindful that what we introduce into our bodies is going to have an effect. And I'm going to, not to give you guys whiplash, but I'm also going to say that peptides, they're gone. Like because they're familiar to the body, they get broken down very easily, which is very different than a drug, right? Sometimes drugs, they stick around for a long time. You have trouble clearing them. Like they've got unintended effects. I've yet to see as big a downside on the peptides, certainly some of the more common ones, than I see with drugs. That doesn't mean there's not something 20 years down the line waiting for us. I can't tell you for sure that there isn't, but it seems to me that because these are naturally occurring compounds in the body and they break down very quickly and the body is able to clear them very quickly, there's a measure of probable comfort in that. I don't want to overstate it. Like, I don't want anybody to walk out of here and say, well, Nat said that they're completely safe, so I should be able to use them any I want. I want to say that, I've seen them be transformative and incredibly useful for people. And especially if you're someone who's got, underlying mold issues, underlying like EBV, parasite, that kind of stuff, those things can really change the landscape in a way that changes the way that your body responds to these things. So you've got to be working with someone who has some familiarity here.
What's the most common way or suggested way for ingesting peptides?
Yeah, so good question. So peptides are proteins. What does your body do with proteins when they land in your stomach? Breaks them down, digests them. So BPC 157 is one of the few that gets a buy because it originates in the gut. You can take BPC 157 orally. You can take it by subcutaneous injection, which I'll explain in a second. It can be used intranasally. I recently just used it topically on a surgical incision, like a small surgical incision to promote healing. It can also be used topically on burns. BPC 157 can also be used in the eyes if it's compounded into specific types of eye drops. So BPC 157 is one of those ones you can use it any which way. It tends to work better for different conditions and for different delivery methods. Most of the other peptides need to be injected subcutaneously. And what subcutaneous injection means is essentially the type of injection that a type 2 diabetic does with insulin. So it's a tiny little needle. It's injected usually into belly fat. It's something anybody can do. You don't need to be a phlebotomist, right? You don't need to go find a vein and do the thing with the...
No, you don't, but you need to have some level of commitment, to be injecting yourself, especially if you have to do it daily for, 8 weeks?
It's a commitment. You want some education around this. You need to understand what hygiene looks like. You need to know, this is a process. This isn't... And I will say that the people who come to it know that they're taking something on that is, it's more than just popping a pill, right? I mean, with BPC, you can pop a pill. There's certain fragments of thymosin beta-4 that are available in an oral capsule. There's a few different ones that can be used orally. There's a number that can be used intranasally. They're tiny, like the bioregulators can be taken orally. They can be... I think it's a whole other podcast if I start getting into the biologic and the synthetic forms of bioregulators, but they can be used either by subcutaneous injection or orally. There's companies now developing sublingual delivery or transdermal delivery. So I think there's a lot of people hard at work trying to figure this stuff out. But, like, for example, there's a drug company called Novo Pharmaceuticals, I think, who just a couple of years ago launched a product on the market that goes under the trade names of either Ozempic or Wegovy. This is a peptide. This is a peptide called semaglutide, which is an analog of GLP-1, which is a naturally occurring protein in the gut. But when we release GLP-1 when we eat, it's gone in 20 seconds or a minute. What they did is they took that GLP-1 agonist, which is semaglutide, and they modified it so that it would have like a 4-day half-life. And what they ended up developing is a drug or a peptide that is injected subcutaneously once a week. And that suppresses appetite. It increases resting metabolic rate. It improves the release of insulin by the pancreas in response to glucose. It improves the uptake of glucose by skeletal muscle cells into muscles. It improves insulin sensitivity. It has protective effects for the heart and the kidney and the brain. And so it's now all of a sudden we have a drug, which is kind of a peptide, only it's a drug now. And it has a proper name, to your point, Sarah, because it's a lot easier to remember Wegovy or Ozempic than it is to remember semaglutide. And that is very highly effective.
Right. So it seems to me like we really are at the start of this, aren't we? We're at the start of this, and this is like biohacker, try at your risk, but potentially, there are big gains to be had here and some very interesting effects. We're definitely going to refer people to your website because I think, like you say, education seems to be the key.
Yeah. So the website, the most education you'll get out of the website at the moment is going to be, you're going to see all the podcasts. And there's a number of podcasts that I've recorded about peptides because it was one of the main reasons why I started a podcast was to get people who knew about peptides to talk to me. But if you sign up for my newsletter, you'll find out as soon as I get my peptide course /resource figured out. And I'm hoping that's going to be in the next couple of months. And again, it's going to be the kind of thing that is going to be it's going to be intended for the layperson and just to help people kind of get a foundation so that even if you decide to go to a physician or whatever, you're going to have more understanding. You'll be able to have a discussion about this stuff. Because again, I answer so many questions from people who are either working with practitioners or physicians who themselves are just getting to know this stuff, or they don't take the time to explain. And you need to know. I just think, if we've learned nothing else in the last couple of years, is we need to become literate about our own bodies and our own health.
It's a great way to close this out. We're at the final minute here. Your website is Nat Niddam, Natniddam, D as in. Give me a good D word. I couldn't think of one quickly there.
D as in David.
David, thank you. So speaking of David's, my son Davis, like we mentioned before, nearly cut his finger off recently, had surgery to reconnect tendons. He's going to be stiff, reconnect nerves. And doing the research on what you're saying, this sounds like something that would really help him in the healing process. Is there a topical cream he should take? Is there something that he should be ingesting to kind of help speed up that kind of flexibility back in his finger and the nerves and all that fun stuff?
Well, yes. I mean, look, thymosin beta-4, you can look it up on PubMed. They did a really interesting study where they transected the Achilles tendons of poor little rats, but they injected thymosin beta-4 and they repaired the Achilles tendon. And Achilles is notoriously difficult to. So for your son, would oral BPC 157 help him? It would help. Would it be more helpful to think about the injectable forms? Probably. He probably can't get to the surgical scars because I'm guessing he's bandaged up and he can't see that stuff. It would speed things up. The good news is he's young and he will heal, right? It's a question of, can we make it faster and can we maybe help the body to do an even better job than it might?
Right. Thank you so much. This is yet again mind blown. My skull's intact still, but mind is blown.
We got something for that, Russ. Don't worry.
Thank you. It's red light. I'm standing in the light today. Thank you.
The red light. Yeah.
Yeah, we got red light and peptides. Probably a winning combination.
Yeah.
For sure. But I think I kind of feel like we still have only scraped like the little surface of that. And I had so many more questions. And of course, there's so many other things. We didn't even get to the spermidine, which is another topic for another day. So I think we'll say goodbye for now, Nathalie, and hopefully we can get you back on again and we can kind of just keep leveling up our knowledge on this because it is so fascinating.
I would love to. Thank you so much. This has been great. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathalie. Take care.
The Rebel Scientist podcast is a Breaking the Gray production, hosted by Sarah Turner and Russ Eisenman. Audio production by Dave Visaya and the podcast engineers. For more information and for our biohacking shopping guide, visit rebelscientist.com. To hear more incredible Breaking the Gray production podcasts, visit breakingthegray.com. That's gray with an E. breakingthegray.com.
Breaking the gray.